Rowan Telluride had built a life in the margins, and she had made peace with it. The mountain village of Ure sat tucked between peaks that scraped the sky, a place where the air bit cold even in summer, and wolves howled their loneliness into the wind. Her healing practice operated out of a stone cottage on the village edge, modest and weathered, with herbs drying from the rafters and the constant smell of yarrow and sage clinging to everything she owned. She treated rogues who had nowhere else to go, commoners who could not afford palace physicians, children with fevers that broke their mothers' hearts. They paid her in bread, in firewood, in hand-sewn blankets that kept the winter from killing her. She never asked for more. Rowan was 24 now, though some days she felt centuries older. Being an Omega in the Western Territories meant existing in a permanent state of underestimation. Too weak, too emotional, too soft for anything that mattered. But her hands knew how to coax broken bones back together, how to draw poison from infected wounds, how to quiet pain that made grown wolves weep. Her gift was rare among Omegas, a healing touch that worked deeper than medicine or bandages could reach. She never understood why she had it, only that she did, and that it burned brightest when her heart ached most. She did not think about the Alpha King anymore, or at least, she told herself she did not. 5 years was long enough to bury most memories, to let them fossilize under layers of new days and quiet routines. But on cold nights when sleep would not come, when the mate bond she had tried so hard to smother flickered in her chest like a candle refusing to die, she remembered. The throne room, his amber eyes locking onto hers, the world tilting sideways as something ancient and undeniable snapped into place between them, and then his voice, cold and final, telling her to leave, telling her she was unsuitable, telling her the council had already arranged his marriage, and there was no room for a poor Omega healer in the life of an Alpha King. She had left that night. He had married Luna Alamosa within the month, and Rowan had learned that some rejections do not kill you quickly. They just hollow you out slowly, one breath at a time, until you become a shell that looks like a person but feels like an empty room. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a wolf she did not recognize. He wore no pack insignia, no royal colours, nothing that would mark him as anything other than a traveller passing through. But the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the village before approaching her door, told Rowan he was a soldier trying very hard to look like he was not. He handed her the sealed envelope without a word, and disappeared before she could ask questions. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used in castles and council chambers. There was no name on the outside, no official seal, just her name written in elegant script that made her stomach twist. She stood in her doorway for a long moment, the envelope heavy in her hands, knowing that opening it would change everything and wishing desperately that she could pretend it had never arrived. But healers do not get to ignore calls for help, even when those calls come from places that once destroyed them. Inside, the message was brief, unsigned, desperate. The heir is dying. You are the only one who can save him. Come to the castle, please. Rowan read it 3 times, her hands trembling harder with each pass. The heir, Silverton's son, a pup she had never met, born from a marriage that should have been hers, dying from something no one else could fix. The cruelty of it was almost poetic, the universe asking her to save the child of the man who had rejected her, the living proof of the life he had chosen over their fated bond. She should have burned the letter, should have sent the soldier back with a refusal, should have protected herself the way Silverton had protected his kingdom when he cast her aside. But even as the thoughts formed, even as every instinct screamed at her to stay away, Rowan knew she would go. because beneath the hurt and the anger and the 5 years of practiced indifference, she was still a healer. And healers do not let children die, even when saving them might kill something inside themselves. She packed her leather satchel that afternoon. Supplies, herbs, bandages, the worn tools of her trade. Everything she owned fit into one bag, a reminder of how little she had built and how easily it could all be left behind. As the sun dipped behind the mountains and turned the sky to bruised purple, Rowan Telluride locked her cottage door and began the 2-day journey to the capital. The Western Territories stretched vast and unforgiving between Ouray and the castle. Rowan travelled on foot, unable to afford a horse, sleeping rough under stars that offered no comfort. Every mile closer made the dormant mate bond in her chest stir a little more, like something waking from a long hibernation. By the second day, it had progressed from a dull ache to a persistent burning, a reminder that proximity to your fated mate is never neutral. It either completes you or destroys you, and she had already learned which one Silverton had chosen. The castle appeared on the horizon just after dawn on the third day, massive stone towers rising against pale sky, banners of the Western Territories snapping in the wind. Rowan had only seen it once before, 5 years ago, when she had arrived as a hopeful young healer seeking employment and left as a rejected Omega with a shattered bond. The sight of it now filled her with a nauseous mixture of dread and something she refused to name. The gates opened before she reached them, as if they had been watching for her arrival. Guards in royal armour flanked the entrance, their expressions carefully neutral. But she saw the way their eyes tracked her movement, the way their hands rested near weapons they did not draw. They were expecting her. Someone had sent that letter, and someone had ordered the gates opened, and Rowan had the unsettling feeling that she was walking into a trap she could not yet see. Inside, the castle was exactly as she remembered. Cold stone corridors, tapestries depicting ancient battles, the smell of wood smoke and authority. But there was something else now, something that had not been there before. A heaviness in the air, a sense of mourning that clung to every surface. The servants who passed her moved with hushed efficiency, their faces drawn and tired. This was a place holding its breath, waiting for death to arrive. A guard led her through winding hallways, deeper into the castle, past rooms she had never seen, and doors that remained closed. They climbed stairs that seemed to go on forever, and with each step, the mate bond burned hotter in her chest. She could feel him now, somewhere close, the connection between them pulling taut like a rope about to snap. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, confused and yearning, unable to understand why they were running toward the thing that had once broken them. The guard stopped in front of a heavy wooden door and knocked twice before pushing it open. Beyond, a room flooded with afternoon light. And standing in the center of it, backlit by windows that overlooked the entire territory, was Silverton Crestone. 5 years had changed him. The young king who had rejected her had been 23, confident in a way that bordered on arrogance, certain that his choices were correct because they were his. The man before her now looked carved from exhaustion. His dark hair was longer, shot through with premature silver at the temples. His amber eyes, which had once burned with authority, now held a hollow desperation that made him look breakable. He wore his crown like a burden instead of a prize, and when he looked at her, really looked at her, something in his carefully constructed composure cracked. They stood that way for a long moment, neither speaking. The mate bond screaming between them loud enough to drown out every rational thought. Rowan felt it trying to complete itself, felt her body swaying toward him against her will, felt her wolf howling for a bond that should have been sealed 5 years ago. Across the room, she watched Silverton's hands curl into fists, watched his jaw clench, watched him fight the same losing battle. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was rougher than she remembered, scraped raw by something that looked a lot like grief. "Thank you for coming." Rowan forced herself to stay still, to keep her voice steady, to remember why she was here. "Your letter said your son is dying." "He is." Silverton's throat worked as he swallowed. "Every healer in the kingdom has tried. Nothing works. He is 3 years old and he has never walked without support. His spine is slowly turning to stone. The physicians say he has weeks at most." "And you think I can help him when they could not?" The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with 5 years of unspoken hurt. "I think you are the only one who can." His eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that looked like drowning. "Please, Rowan, I am not asking as your king. I am asking as a father who is watching his child die." She wanted to hate him, wanted to feel nothing but the cold satisfaction of watching the man who had rejected her beg for her help. But standing there, seeing the way grief had hollowed him out, seeing the desperate love of a parent written across every line of his face, all she felt was tired. "Where is he?" Silverton led her through another door, into an adjoining room that had been converted into a nursery. And there, lying motionless on a bed, piled with cushions and blankets, was Ashlyn. The pup was small, painfully so, with white fur that seemed too bright against the dark fabrics surrounding him. Metal braces wrapped around his hind legs, cruel and mechanical, the kind of thing you put on a broken machine rather than a living child. His breathing came shallow and labored, each inhale a visible effort. But his eyes, when they flickered open to look at the newcomers, were his father's exactly. Amber and bright, and holding on to hope with a fierceness that made Rowan's heart crack. She moved toward him slowly, instinct overriding everything else. This was a child in pain, and she was a healer, and nothing else mattered in that moment. She knelt beside the bed, keeping her movements careful and non-threatening, the way she would approach any frightened patient. "Hello, Ashlyn. My name is Rowan. May I look at you?" The pup's eyes tracked her face, then shifted to his father standing behind her. Some silent communication passed between them before Ashlyn gave a tiny nod. Permission granted. Rowan reached out and placed her hand gently on the pup's shoulder. Just a light touch meant to reassure, to assess, to let her healing sense read what was wrong. The moment her skin made contact, agony exploded through her body. It was not physical pain, though it felt like lightning in her veins. It was the mate bond, dormant and damaged for 5 years, suddenly roaring back to life with a violence that stole her breath. Every nerve ending caught fire. Her wolf surged forward, desperate and confused, trying to complete a bond that had been left bleeding and raw. The room spun. Her vision whited out. And through it all, she felt Silverton, felt him like he was inside her skin, felt the bond reaching for him with hooks and teeth, and refused to be denied. Across the room, she heard him collapse, heard the crash of his body hitting the floor, heard the strangled sound that ripped from his throat. The guards who had been standing at attention rushed forward, shouting, but their voices sounded like they were coming from underwater. Rowan yanked her hand back from Ashlyn, gasping, shaking, her healing sense still active and screaming information at her that she could barely process. But even in the chaos, even through the pain of the mate bond trying to tear her apart from the inside, she understood. This was not a disease. This was not a curse. This was a bloodline rejection. The pup's wolf was rejecting his own body because his father's fated mate bond was incomplete, and she, the rejected mate, was the only one who could stop it. The door burst open, and royal physicians rushed in, surrounding Silverton, checking his pulse, demanding to know what happened. But he pushed them away, struggling to his feet, his amber eyes locked on Rowan with an expression that held too many things to name: understanding, guilt, terror. "You felt it," she said, and it was not a question. "I have always felt it." His voice was barely a whisper. "I thought if I ignored it long enough, if I pretended the bond did not exist, it would fade. I was wrong." One of the physicians, an older wolf with grey streaking his muzzle, cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should explain to the healer what she is dealing with." Silverton did not break eye contact with Rowan. "Tell her." The physician turned to her, his expression grave. "The young prince suffers from incomplete bond syndrome. It occurs when an alpha king's heir is conceived outside of a true fated mate bond. The pup's genetics are at war with themselves, trying to reconcile bloodlines that should not exist together. The spine ossifies, the limbs fail, and eventually the internal organs begin to shut down. There is no medical cure because it is not a medical condition. It is a fundamental rejection written into his very DNA." Rowan looked at Ashlyn, at the small white pup struggling to breathe, at the metal braces that were doing nothing to save him. "And you have known this whole time?" "We suspected from birth," the physician admitted, "but we only confirmed it 3 months ago, when the deterioration accelerated. By then it was already too late to prevent." "Too late to prevent," Rowan repeated slowly, the full horror of it settling over her. "Because preventing it would have required Silverton to complete his fated mate bond before his son was born, which he could not do, because he had already rejected me and married someone else." The silence that followed was answer enough. Rowan stood, her legs unsteady, her entire body still trembling from the mate bond's violent reawakening. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far from this castle and this king and this impossible situation as her legs could carry her. Healing Ashlyn would mean touching him again, and touching him would mean enduring that agony repeatedly, feeling the mate bond scream for completion while knowing it would never be allowed to finish. It would be torture, slow and exquisite, and it might destroy her completely. But even as the thoughts formed, even as fear threatened to drown her, Rowan looked down at Ashlyn. The pup was watching her with his father's eyes, and in them she saw no manipulation, no expectation, just the quiet desperation of a child who knew he was dying and did not understand why. "Please, do not leave me," Ashlyn whispered, his voice so small it barely carried across the room. And Rowan, who had sworn 5 years ago never to let Silverton Crestone hurt her again, felt her resolve crumble into dust. She took a breath that hurt, then another. Then she looked at the Alpha King and said the words that would seal her fate: "I will try to save him." Is Chapter 2. The first healing session began at dawn, when the castle was still wrapped in grey light and morning mist clung to the stone walls like something alive. Rowan had not slept. She had spent the night in a guest chamber that was far too luxurious for someone like her, staring at the ceiling and trying to prepare herself for what was coming. But there was no preparing for this. No amount of mental fortitude could shield her from what she knew was about to happen. When she entered the nursery, Ashlyn was already awake, his small white form barely visible among the blankets. The metal braces on his hind legs caught the early light, throwing fractured reflections across the walls. Silverton stood near the window, his back to her. But she felt the exact moment he became aware of her presence. The mate bond, which had settled into a dull ache overnight, immediately flared hot and insistent. She ignored it, ignored him, focused entirely on the pup who needed her. Rowan knelt beside the bed and placed both hands on Ashlyn's spine, right where the ossification was worst. The agony hit instantly, just as brutal as the first time. Fire in her veins, her wolf howling, the mate bond clawing desperately toward completion. But she had expected it this time, had braced for it, and she forced herself to push through the pain and find her healing sense beneath it. There. She could feel Ashlyn's wolf, small and frightened, and fighting a losing battle against its own body. Could feel where the genetic rejection was strongest, where the spine was hardening into something that would eventually stop his heart. She poured her healing energy into those places, coaxing, soothing, trying to convince his wolf that it was safe to exist in this body. Behind her, she heard Silverton's breathing change, heard the sharp intake of breath that meant he was feeling everything she felt. The mate bond connected them whether they wanted it or not, and when she healed, he experienced it too. The pain, the effort, the desperate hope that this would work. After 30 minutes, Rowan had to stop. Her hands were shaking so badly she could no longer maintain contact, and her healing energy was depleted. She pulled back, gasping, and immediately the bond's intensity lessened. Not gone, never gone, but bearable again. Ashlyn's breathing had eased slightly, not much, but enough to notice. Did it work? Silverton's voice came from somewhere behind her, rough and uncertain. It helped, Rowan said without looking at him, but this is not something that can be fixed in one session. His condition has been progressing for 3 years. It will take time to reverse. How much time? I do not know. She stood, her legs unsteady, and finally turned to face him. He looked worse than he had the day before, if that was possible. Dark circles under his eyes, exhaustion written across every feature. I will come back tomorrow. She left before he could respond, before the mate bond could pull her closer, before she could make the mistake of asking him if he understood what he was doing to her, because he had to understand. He was feeling it too. The excruciating burn of an incomplete bond forced into proximity. But unlike her, he had chosen this, had chosen his crown and his political marriage and his kingdom over the bond that should have been sacred. She was just the omega he had left behind, now dragged back to clean up the consequences of his choice. The second day was worse. The third day, worse still. By the end of the first week, Rowan had established a routine that was slowly destroying her. She woke before dawn, forced herself to eat something she could not taste, walked to the nursery with legs that felt heavier each day. Spent an hour with her hands on Ashlyn, healing what she could, while the mate bond tried to tear her apart from the inside. Then she retreated to her chamber, collapsed onto the bed, and tried not to think about how much of this she could endure before it broke something in her that could not be fixed. Ashlyn was improving, slowly, painfully slowly, but improving. His breathing came easier. The ossification in his spine had stopped progressing and might even be reversing. Once, on the 5th day, his back legs twitched with something that looked almost like voluntary movement. But the cost was mounting. Every session made the mate bond stronger, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. Rowan found herself thinking about Silverton at odd moments, her wolf fixating on his scent, on the memory of his voice, on the desperate look in his eyes when he watched her heal his son. It was not love, she told herself. It was just the bond, doing what bonds do, trying to complete itself regardless of whether completion would destroy them both. And Silverton was suffering too. She could see it in the way his hands shook when she was near, in the way he gripped the window frame like he needed something to hold on to, in the way he left the room more and more frequently as the sessions progressed. On the seventh day, he did not come to the nursery at all. A royal physician stayed with her instead, watching silently as she worked. But the mate bond still burned through her, because proximity did not require line of sight. She could feel him somewhere in the castle, could feel his wolf pacing and snarling and demanding something they could not have. That afternoon, Rowan encountered Lunar Alamosa for the first time. The political Luna was standing in one of the castle's long corridors, backlit by a window, looking like something carved from ice. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, all sharp edges and perfect composition. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elaborate style that must have taken hours, and her gown was the deep green of the Eastern Pacs. But her eyes, when they landed on Rowan, held no warmth, just a hollow recognition that made Rowan's stomach twist. They stared at each other for a long moment, two women trapped in a situation neither had chosen, connected by a man who belonged fully to neither of them. Finally, Alamosa spoke, her voice cool and controlled. "You are the Omega healer." "Yes." "The one he rejected 5 years ago." Rowan felt something sharp lodge in her throat. "Yes." Alamosa moved closer, her footsteps silent on the stone floor, until she stood directly in front of Rowan. Up close, the cracks in her perfect facade became visible. The tightness around her eyes, the faint lines of stress bracketing her mouth, the way her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "I have always known," she said quietly, "from the moment we married. I felt his distance, felt the way he would not fully bond with me, the way his wolf remained separate and contained. I told myself it was just his personality that some alphas were naturally more reserved. But I knew." "I am sorry," Rowan said, because she did not know what else to say. "Do not be." Alamosa's laugh was bitter and sharp. "I entered this marriage with open eyes, a political alliance to prevent war, to secure borders, to build power. Love was never part of the arrangement. But I thought over time, something real might grow, that we might build a partnership even without a fated bond. I was wrong." Rowan wanted to leave, wanted to be anywhere but this corridor having this conversation. But something kept her rooted in place, something in the other woman's expression that looked too much like her own pain. "I watch you heal his son," Alamosa continued, her voice dropping lower. "I watch the way his entire body orients toward you when you enter a room. I watch him fight a bond that is trying to complete itself, and I finally understand the full scope of what he sacrificed, what we both sacrificed. You are his mate, his true Luna, and I am just the woman who wears the crown because he needed someone to stand beside him for appearances." "I did not come here to take anything from you," Rowan said, and meant it. "I know." Alamosa's expression softened slightly, something almost like sympathy flickering across her features. "You came here to save a pup, to do what healers do regardless of personal cost. But whether you intended it or not, your presence has exposed a truth we were all pretending did not exist." She paused, then added more quietly, "Save the pup. Please. Ashlyn deserves to live regardless of the mistakes his father made, but do not save him." She tilted her head toward the direction of the throne room, where Silverton would be attending to kingdom business. "Let him live with what he has done." Then she walked away, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, leaving Rowan standing alone, with words that felt like a curse and a blessing tangled together. The court had begun to notice. Rowan heard the whispers as she moved through the castle, saw the way servants' eyes tracked her movements, felt the weight of speculation following her everywhere. They were not subtle about it. Guards muttered to each other when she passed. Ladies of the court stopped their conversations to stare. Even the royal council members, with all their practiced political neutrality, could not hide their curiosity. The rumours built like a storm gathering strength. Some said she was the Alpha King's secret lover, summoned to the castle for forbidden meetings. Others whispered that she was a sorceress, using dark magic to heal the prince while ensnaring the king. A few, the ones who were older and wiser and remembered how fated mate bonds worked, spoke in hushed tones about rejected mates and incomplete bonds and the price of choosing duty over destiny. Silverton's sister, Evelyn, confronted him on the 9th day. Rowan was not present for the conversation, but she heard about it from a servant who had been standing guard outside the council chamber. Heard how Evelyn had demanded to know why he had summoned his rejected mate back to the castle, why he was torturing them both this way, why he refused to either complete the bond or let Rowan leave. His response, according to the servant, had been silence. Just long, terrible silence, while his sister listed all the ways this situation was destroying everyone it touched. On the 10th day, everything changed. The healing session started normally. Rowan placed her hands on Aislinn's spine, pushed past the mate bond's agony, found her healing sense and began to work. But something was different this time. Aislinn's wolf was more responsive, more present, as if it had finally begun to trust that healing was possible. Encouraged, Rowan pushed harder, poured more energy into the damaged areas, tried to accelerate the reversal that had been progressing so slowly. It was too much. Aisling screamed, a high, keening sound that no 3-year-old should be able to make, and his small body convulsed. The metal braces on his legs rattled violently. His back arched in a way that looked wrong, painful, dangerous. Rowan tried to pull back, tried to ease off the healing energy, but the mate bond had other ideas. It surged forward with a force she could not control, pulling her deeper into the connection, binding her to Aisling in a way that felt permanent and terrifying. She felt his pain like it was her own, felt his wolf's panic, felt the exact moment when her healing energy became too much for his small body to process. She had to stop, had to pull away before she hurt him worse, but her hands would not move. The mate bond had taken over, using her healing gift as a conduit to complete itself, and she was trapped in the middle of something she could not control. Then Silverton was there, his hands closing around her wrists, pulling her bodily away from his son. The moment their skin touched, the mate bond exploded. It was not like the burning ache that had been building for days. This was total, complete, overwhelming connection. She felt Silverton's wolf like it was inside her chest, felt his fear for his son and his desperate need for her, and his soul, deep regret for everything he had done. Felt the bond reaching for completion with hooks and teeth, demanding, screaming, refusing to be denied any longer. They collapsed together, hitting the floor hard, their bodies tangled and shaking. The bond was trying to complete itself by force, trying to seal them together permanently, and it took every shred of Rowan's willpower to fight it, to pull herself back from the edge of something that would bind her to this man forever. Across from her, Silverton was fighting the same battle. His amber eyes were wild, his breathing ragged, his entire body trembling with the effort of resisting a biological imperative that was designed to be irresistible. They pulled apart finally, gasping, crawling away from each other on the stone floor like wounded animals. The distance helped. Not much, but enough that Rowan could think again, could remember that completing the bond would solve nothing. He was still married to another woman, still an alpha king with responsibilities that did not include a poor omega healer. Still the man who had rejected her once and would do it again if his kingdom required it. Behind them, Ashlyn had stopped screaming. The royal physicians were surrounding him, checking his vitals, murmuring urgent assessments. But Rowan could not focus on that. Could not focus on anything except the way her entire body ached for completion, for Silverton, for a bond that would destroy her if she let it finish. "I cannot do this," she said, her voice shaking. "I cannot be near you and not—" "I know," Silverton interrupted, and he sounded wrecked, completely wrecked. "I know." They stared at each other across the nursery floor, both of them broken and burning, and Rowan made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. "Tomorrow will be the last session. I will put everything I have into one final healing. If it works, Ashlyn lives. If it does not—" She could not finish that sentence, could not say out loud what failure would mean. "And then you will leave." It was not a question. "And then I leave," she confirmed, "because this is killing us both, and your son deserves better than a healer who cannot function anymore." Silverton opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, wanted to beg her to stay, wanted to say any of the 1,000 things written across his face. But in the end, he just nodded, because he knew she was right, because there was no other choice left that would not destroy them completely. That night, Rowan did not sleep. She sat in her chamber and prepared herself for what tomorrow would require. To save Ashlyn, she would have to surrender completely to the mate bond, stop fighting it, stop holding back, and let it flow through her with no barriers or protections. It would be agony. It might kill her. But it was the only way to pour enough healing energy into the pup to reverse 3 years of genetic damage in a single session. And after, assuming she survived it, she would pack her leather satchel and walk out of this castle and never return. She would go back to Ure, to her stone cottage and her quiet practice and her life in the margins. And she would spend however many years she had left, slowly dying from an incomplete mate bond that refused to let her go. It was not a good plan, but it was the only one she had. Chapter 3. Dawn came too quickly and not quickly enough. Rowan stood at her chamber window and watched the sun rise over the Western Territories, painting the mountains gold and pink, beautiful and indifferent to the tragedy playing out beneath them. This was the 14th day, the last day. After this, one way or another, it would be over. She dressed in the same simple clothes she had worn every day, tied her red hair back with a leather cord, and picked up her satchel. She would not be returning to this room. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would leave directly from the nursery, walk out of the castle gates, and not look back. Looking back would kill her. The corridors were empty this early, the castle still half asleep. But when she reached the nursery, she found the door already open and Silverton inside with his son. He had not slept either, she could tell. His clothes were rumpled, his hair dishevelled, and he looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, trying to decide whether to jump or be pushed. Ashlyn was worse. Whatever progress they had made over the previous days had been undone by yesterday's disaster. His breathing was shallow and laboured again, his small body barely moving except for the rise and fall of his chest. The metal braces seemed to weigh him down, a constant reminder of how broken he was. When his amber eyes flickered open to look at his father, there was a resignation in them that no child should possess. He knew he was dying, had probably known for a while. "I need everyone to leave," Rowan said quietly. "What I am about to do cannot be witnessed." The royal physicians who had been monitoring Ashlyn overnight looked to Silverton for confirmation. He nodded once, sharp and final, and they filed out without argument. But Silverton himself did not move. "You too?" Rowan said. "No." His voice left no room for negotiation. "He is my son. I am not leaving him." She wanted to argue, wanted to explain that having him in the room would make this infinitely harder, that the mate bond would use his proximity to dig its hooks deeper. But looking at his face, at the desperate love of a father watching his child slip away, she could not bring herself to force him out. "Fine. But stay back. Do not interfere no matter what happens." He positioned himself near the window, as far from the bed as the room allowed, and Rowan turned her full attention to Ashlyn. The pup watched her with his father's eyes, so much trust and hope in that gaze that it made her chest hurt. "I'm going to try something different today," she told him gently. "It might hurt at first, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Ashlyn nodded, the movement so small it was barely visible. Rowan knelt beside the bed, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, and placed both hands on Ashlyn's spine. But this time, instead of fighting the mate bond, instead of trying to push through it or ignore it or pretend it did not exist, she surrendered to it completely. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The mate bond roared to life with a violence that stole her breath, but instead of fighting it, Rowan opened herself to it. Let it flood through her like a dam breaking. The pain was transcendent, beyond anything she had experienced before, but beneath the pain was something else. Power. Raw, unfiltered, massive power, born from a fated bond that had been denied for 5 years and was finally being allowed to exist. Her healing energy amplified 1,000-fold. She felt it pouring into Ashlyn like liquid starlight, like every good thing in the universe concentrated into a single point. His wolf responded instantly, unfurling like a flower that had been waiting for the right conditions to bloom. She felt the genetic rejection that had been killing him begin to unravel, felt his DNA remembering how to exist in harmony instead of war, felt the ossification in his spine start to reverse. But the mate bond was not satisfied with just healing. It wanted completion. It wanted Silverton. Across the room, she felt rather than saw him collapse. The bond was tearing through him with equal force, connecting them in a way that was both agony and ecstasy, destroying them and rebuilding them at the same time. She felt his wolf reaching for hers, felt the desperate need to close the distance between them, to finish what they had started 5 years ago in a throne room when their eyes first met. It would be so easy. She was already halfway there, already falling into the bond, already losing herself in the connection. All she would have to do was stop resisting, let the bond take her. Accept that Silverton Crestone was her mate, regardless of his choices, regardless of his crown, regardless of everything that stood between them. But that would mean accepting a life of being his secret. His hidden mate, while another woman wore the crown, his shameful reminder of a bond he had tried to deny, and Rowan had more respect for herself than that, even if the bond did not. So she held on, kept her focus on Ashlyn, poured everything she had into healing this pup, and refused to let the bond pull her any further toward its inevitable conclusion. Time became meaningless. She had no idea if she had been kneeling there for minutes or hours. All she knew was the healing energy flowing through her, the mate bond screaming for completion, and Ashlyn's small body growing stronger beneath her hands. The ossification reversed. The genetic rejection stopped. His wolf settled into his body like it had finally found home. And then, impossibly, miraculously, Ashlyn moved. It started with his back legs, still wrapped in metal braces. twitching with real voluntary movement. Then the braces themselves began to crack, unable to contain the sudden surge of strength, as muscles that had never worked properly suddenly remembered their purpose. The metal split with a sharp sound, pieces clattering to the floor, and Ashlin's legs kicked free. The pup's eyes flew wide open. His breathing, which had been so shallow and laboured, suddenly came deep and easy. And before Rowan could process what was happening, before she could stop him or help him or even react, Ashlyn stood up. He stood on his own 4 legs for the first time in 3 years. Stood without support, without pain, without the weight of a death sentence hanging over him. He took a tentative step, then another, then looked at his father with an expression of pure, unbridled joy. For a moment, the entire world held its breath. Then Silverton made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob or both, and fell completely apart. The Alpha King of the Western Territories, who had ruled his kingdom with an iron fist and made impossible choices in the name of duty, dropped to the stone floor and broke. Not with relief, though that was part of it. Not with joy, though that was there too, but with the full crushing weight of what he had done. The realization of what his choices had cost, written across every shaking sob, every gasping breath, every tear that fell unchecked down his face. He had rejected his fated mate for political power, had gambled his son's life on the assumption that he could make a kingdom without a true lunar, had condemned 3 people to half-lives for a crown that suddenly felt worthless compared to what he had sacrificed to wear it. Rowan stood on shaking legs, her hands still glowing faintly with residual healing energy, and watched the most powerful wolf in the Western Territories come undone. Part of her wanted to go to him, to comfort him, to tell him that Ashlyn would be all right now. But a larger part, the part that had been broken 5 years ago and had spent every day since trying to rebuild herself, knew that going to him now would be a mistake she could never take back. Behind Silverton, the door opened. Luna Alamosa stood in the threshold, drawn by the sounds of crying, or perhaps by some instinct that told her something fundamental had shifted. She took in the scene with a single glance. Ashlyn standing whole and healthy. Silverton broken on the floor, Rowan standing apart, clearly preparing to leave. And in her expression, Rowan saw understanding, acceptance, and something that looked almost like relief. Alamosa stepped fully into the room, her movements graceful and controlled, even now. She walked past her husband without acknowledging him, knelt beside Ashlyn, and wrapped her arms around the pup she had raised as her own. The pup who was biologically hers but genetically rejected because his father's mate bond had been incomplete. "You are all right," she whispered into his white fur. "You are finally all right." Then she stood, turned to face Rowan, and inclined her head in a gesture that was part gratitude and part goodbye. She understood what was about to happen, understood that the true Luna was leaving, and that she would remain as the political placeholder, and that all of them would spend the rest of their lives living with the consequences of choices made years ago. It was not fair. It was not right. But it was what they had. Silverton finally looked up, his amber eyes red and raw and devastated. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Tried to stand, but his legs would not support him. So he just knelt there on the stone floor and stared at Rowan like she was the sun, and he had been living in darkness for 5 years and was only now remembering what light looked like. "Stay," he finally managed, and it was barely a whisper. Just that one word. A plea, not a command. A desperate, hopeless request from a man who knew he had no right to ask, but could not stop himself from trying. The mate bond pulled at Rowan like hooks in her soul, urging her to say yes, to forget everything, and just accept whatever scraps of a bond he could offer her. But she had learned, over 5 years of exile and healing and slowly rebuilding herself, that she was worth more than scraps, that she deserved a mate who chose her first, not last, that loving someone who could never fully be hers would destroy her more completely than any rejection ever could. "I saved your son," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "That was the miracle. There is not another one coming." She picked up her leather satchel, the same one she had carried into this castle 2 weeks ago, and walked toward the door. Every step felt like tearing off a piece of her own soul. The mate bond screamed at her to stop, to turn around, to give him one more chance. But she kept walking. She passed Alamosa, who watched her with hollow eyes that held no anger, only understanding. Past Ashlyn, who was too young to comprehend what was happening, but would someday learn that he lived because an Omega healer had sacrificed everything to save him. Past Silverton, who remained on the floor, destroyed by choices he had made when he thought duty was more important than destiny. The corridor outside was filling with people. Word had spread that something was happening in the royal nursery, and courtiers and servants and guards were gathering, whispering, speculating. They parted like a wave as Rowan walked through them, her red braid swinging with each step, her face set in an expression that discouraged questions. She walked through the castle she had first entered 5 years ago with hope in her heart, walked past rooms where she had once imagined she might belong, walked down stairs she had climbed with dreams of a future that would never exist. And with each step, the mate bond pulled tighter, a living thing connecting her to a man she was leaving behind, a connection that would slowly kill them both now that she was walking away. The castle gates stood open, morning light spilling through them, offering escape. Rowan reached them and paused, her hand resting on the cold iron, one last moment of doubt making her hesitate. She heard footsteps behind her, heavy, running, desperate. For a moment, her heart surged with irrational hope. But when she turned, it was not Silverton. It was Evelyn, his sister, the one who had sent the original letter begging Rowan to come. "Please," Evelyn said, breathless from running, "please do not leave like this. Give him a chance to—" "To what?" Rowan interrupted, not unkindly. "To apologize for rejecting me, to offer me a place as his hidden mate while his legal wife sits on the throne beside him, to ask me to live in the shadows of a castle that should have been partly mine, watching him fulfill obligations to another woman while the bond burns through both of us." She shook her head. "I saved Ashlyn. That is what I came here to do. The rest is not my responsibility to fix." "The bond will kill you," Evelyn said desperately. "An incomplete mate bond, left to deteriorate, it destroys both parties. You know this." "I know," Rowan said simply. "But I would rather die slowly from a bond I walked away from than live slowly in a bond I am not allowed to complete. At least this way, the choice is mine." She turned back to the gates, to the world beyond them, to the mountain village of Ouray, where she could disappear and pretend for a few more years that she was whole. She took one step forward, then another, her boots crunching on the gravel path. Behind her, in the castle, Ashlyn was discovering that he could run, was bounding through the corridors with puppy energy that made the staff weep with joy and relief. The heir to the Western Territories was whole and healthy and would grow up to be a strong alpha, all because an Omega healer had loved him enough to destroy herself, saving him. Behind her, in the castle, Luna Alamosa was returning to her chambers to stare at a crown she had never wanted and a marriage that had been dead from the start, trying to find some way to live with the knowledge that she would spend the rest of her life as a placeholder for a bond that should have been. Behind her, in the castle, Silverton Crestone remained on the floor of the nursery, broken by joy and regret in equal measure, learning that some choices cannot be unmade, no matter how much you wish you could take them back. And between them all, the mate bond pulled and burned and refused to die, a living thing that would slowly destroy them both now that Rowan had walked away. But at least this destruction was on her terms. At least this time, the choice to leave had been hers. The castle gates closed behind her with a final, echoing boom. Rowan did not look back, did not let herself imagine Silverton standing at his window watching her go, did not acknowledge the mate bond that was already beginning its slow work of killing them both. She just walked, one foot in front of the other, away from the castle and the king and the life that might have been, toward Ure and obscurity and whatever years she had left. The morning sun climbed higher, indifferent to the tragedy of incomplete bonds and rejected mates, and the bond, cruel and eternal and impossibly strong, began its work of destroying them both one heartbeat at a time.